A new beginning. The soft hum of the moving van faded into the distance as Clara Johnson stood on the cracked sidewalk outside their new Hillcrest home. The modest two-story structure with white siding and blue shutters seemed to blink at her, as if unsure whether to welcome the family or remain indifferent. Clara's fingers tightened around the keys, their cold metallic edge grounding her in a moment that felt both surreal and daunting. Behind her, Elijah and Serena stood silently, their identical features etched with a mix of apprehension and defiance. The 14-year-old twins were inseparable, their bond forged through years of shared victories and heartbreaks. They were the kind of kids who finished each other's sentences, outperformed their peers, and bore the weight of their father's sudden death with a quiet strength that belied their years. "Ready?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with forced cheerfulness. Neither twin answered immediately. Serena adjusted the strap of her backpack, her dark braids swaying as she cast a wary glance at the unfamiliar street. Elijah simply nodded, his sharp brown eyes scanning the neighborhood with the precision of a chess player analyzing a new board. The silence between them spoke volumes, their unspoken thoughts echoing the same refrain. "This isn't home." Clara unlocked the front door, pushing it open to reveal a house that felt painfully empty. The bare walls and echoing rooms were a stark contrast to the warmth and life of their Chicago apartment. Elijah and Serena hesitated in the doorway, their footsteps hesitant as if crossing into another world. The twins followed their mother through the house, their movements synchronized like shadows. The living room, with its pale beige carpet and single ceiling fan, felt foreign. The kitchen, though modern, lacked the aroma of Clara's cooking that had been a constant in their lives. And the bedrooms, though larger than what they were used to, felt too quiet, too still. "It'll feel like home soon," Clara said, her voice soft but hopeful. "We just need to make it ours." Elijah and Serena exchanged a glance. For them, home wasn't just a place. It was the sound of their father's laughter, the sight of him leaning over their math homework with unyielding patience, and the warmth of their family dinners. This new house, with its pristine walls and unfamiliar silence, felt like an empty shell. Clara crouched to their level, her gaze steady and firm. "I know this is hard. It's hard for me too. But this move is about us starting fresh, together. Your dad would want us to be strong." The mention of their father brought a flicker of emotion to Serena's face. Elijah bit his lip, his hands curling into fists at his sides. They both nodded, not trusting themselves to speak. The first day of school arrived too soon. Clara dropped the twins off at Hillcrest High, her encouraging words lingering in the air as they stood at the foot of the wide stone steps. The school loomed before them, its red brick facade imposing and unfamiliar. Students milled about in clusters, their laughter and chatter creating a cacophony that only heightened the twins' sense of isolation. "Remember," Clara had said that morning, "you're both brilliant. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The memory of her words spurred them forward. Elijah adjusted the straps of his backpack, his jaw set with quiet determination. Serena brushed her fingers over the hem of her skirt, her lips pressed into a thin line. Together, they ascended the steps and entered the bustling hallway. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Whispers followed them as they navigated the crowded corridors, the only black students in a sea of unfamiliar faces. Some stares were curious, others calculating. The twins, used to being in the minority but not to being so openly scrutinized, kept their heads high and their gazes forward. Their first class was math, a subject they both loved and excelled at. Room 204 was located at the end of a long hallway lined with blue lockers. As they entered, a tall woman with sharp features and graying hair glanced up from her desk. Her piercing blue eyes swept over the twins, lingering for a moment before narrowing slightly. "You must be the Johnson twins," she said, her tone clipped. "Yes, Mom," Serena replied, her voice steady. The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on the advanced math textbooks tucked under their arms. "I'm Mrs. Grace. she said, her voice carrying an edge. "We run a rigorous program here at Hillcrest. I hope you're prepared for the challenge." The word hung in the air like a veiled warning. Serena and Elijah exchanged a quick glance, their expressions unreadable. Mrs. Grace pointed to two seats on opposite sides of the room. "Elijah, you can sit by the window. Serena, near the door." The twins hesitated. They were used to working together, their combined intellect a force to be reckoned with. But they obeyed, taking their assigned seats without complaint. The lesson began with Mrs. Grace presenting a challenging algebra problem on the board. "Who would like to solve this?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the class. The room fell silent. Students exchanged nervous glances, some ducking their heads to avoid eye contact. The equation was complex, its layers of variables and quadratic functions daunting to most. Elijah raised his hand, the motion confident but unassuming. Across the room, Serena's hand shot up as well, her eyes alight with understanding. Mrs. Grace's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She pointed to Elijah, her expression unreadable. "Go ahead," she said, stepping aside. Elijah approached the board with quiet assurance. He picked up the marker and began solving the problem, his movements precise and deliberate. As he worked, he explained each step, his voice steady and clear. "First, we identify the quadratic expression," he said, writing out the initial steps. "Then we factor to find the roots." Serena couldn't help but interject. "And don't forget to check for extraneous solutions in the denominator." Elijah nodded, incorporating her suggestion seamlessly. Within minutes, the problem was solved, the board filled with neat calculations that led to the correct answer. Mrs. Grace's expression hardened as she examined the work. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze flicked between Elijah and Serena. "Well," she said, her tone carrying a note of skepticism, "it seems you've managed to solve this one. But don't expect every problem to be this easy. This is a demanding course, and one correct answer doesn't guarantee future success." Her words, though framed as advice, were laced with condescension. The twins returned to their seats, their victory tinged with bitterness. The challenge they faced at Hillcrest was more than academic, and they both knew it. But what Mrs. Grace didn't know was that the twins were more than ready to prove her wrong. This was only the beginning, a shadow of prejudice. Elijah sat by the classroom window, his gaze flickering between the math textbook on his desk and the bustling courtyard outside. He could still feel Mrs. Grace's icy stare from earlier that morning. Her disapproval had been palpable, her words laced with a condescension that left an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. Serena sat across the room, her back straight, and her hand poised to jot down notes, though her expression mirrored her brother's unease. The lesson continued with Mrs. Grace walking the aisles, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She paused at random desks, peering over students' shoulders as they worked through practice problems. When she reached Elijah's desk, she stopped, her shadow falling over his notebook. "Let's see," she said, her tone clipped as she leaned in to inspect his work. Elijah's calculations were flawless, each step meticulously documented. Yet Mrs. Grace frowned, tapping her pen against the desk. You're overly thorough. Sometimes simplicity is better, Mr. Johnson." Elijah bit back a retort. His father had always taught him that precision was key in problem solving, a philosophy that had carried him and Serena to academic success. He simply nodded, his fingers gripping his pencil tightly. Across the room, Serena bristled. She knew her brother's restrained posture all too well, a sign he was holding back anger or frustration. Mrs. Grace moved on, her comments leaving a trail of unease in her wake. At lunch, the twins found a quiet corner of the cafeteria, away from the clusters of students who eyed them curiously but said nothing. They unwrapped their sandwiches in silence, the earlier incident weighing heavily on their minds. "She doesn't like us," Serena finally said, her voice low but firm. She tore a piece of bread from her sandwich, her fingers fidgeting with it. "She doesn't know us," Elijah replied, though his tone carried a trace of doubt. Maybe she's like this with everyone. Serena raised an eyebrow. Did you hear how she praised that other kid for getting half the problem right? She didn't even glance at his notebook. Elijah sighed, his appetite fading. Yeah, I noticed. But what can we do? She's the teacher. We just have to push through. Serena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Pushing through isn't enough. We have to excel. We have to be so good that she has no choice but to acknowledge us. Elijah nodded slowly. It was a challenge they had faced before, proving themselves in the face of bias. They were no strangers to the quiet prejudices that often lurked in new environments. Back in Chicago, their father had always encouraged them to rise above, to let their accomplishments speak louder than anyone's doubts. Fine, Elijah said, determination hardening in his voice. Let's give her nothing to criticize. The twins threw themselves into their studies with renewed vigor. They stayed late in the library after school, poring over advanced textbooks and practicing equations well beyond their grade level. Serena worked on perfecting her public speaking skills for debate, while Elijah honed his analytical thinking with increasingly complex math puzzles. Together, they became a force of quiet excellence, their synergy unmatched. But their efforts didn't go unnoticed. During a review session the following week, Mrs. Grace assigned group work, pairing students to solve a series of challenging problems. Elijah and Serena, though sitting on opposite sides of the room, quickly became the natural leaders of their respective groups. Their classmates looked to them for guidance, their confidence in the twins' abilities evident. As Elijah explained a particularly tricky concept to his group, Mrs. Grace loomed nearby, her arms crossed. Her eyes narrowed as she listened, her lips pressed into a tight line. When the group presented their solution, she nodded curtly but offered no praise. Later, when Serena's group completed their task with similar success, Mrs. Grace's reaction was the same. A nod and a terse, "Well done," delivered with a tone that implied anything but. The twins exchanged glances across the room, their silent communication carrying the same thought. She's not just tough. She's dismissive, especially of us. The tipping point came during a surprise quiz. Mrs. Grace handed out the papers with a faint smirk. "This will separate the diligent from the careless," she announced, her tone dripping with challenge. The problems were intricate, requiring both speed and precision. Elijah and Serena, however, thrived under pressure. They worked methodically, their pencils flying across the paper as they tackled each question with confidence. When Mrs. Grace collected the quizzes, she lingered near Elijah's desk. "Let's hope you didn't overthink this time," she remarked, loud enough for nearby students to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Elijah's ears burned, but he kept his head down, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. 2 days later, the quizzes were returned. The twins' papers were marked with perfect scores, their work exemplary. Yet, when Mrs. Grace handed them back, her praise was conspicuously absent. "Well," she said, her voice flat, "it seems you've managed this one. But don't let it go to your heads. Consistency is key." Her words stung more than outright criticism. The twins knew they had proven themselves, yet her reluctance to acknowledge their success felt like an intentional slight. That evening, as they sat in their living room, Clara noticed their somber expressions. She set aside the book she'd been reading and joined them on the couch. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. Elijah hesitated, glancing at Serena. She nodded, encouraging him to speak. "It's our math teacher," he began. "She's not fair." Clara's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "She doesn't treat us the same as the other students," Serena explained. "Even when we do well, she acts like it's not good enough. Like we don't belong there." Clara's expression darkened. "Have you talked to her about this?" The twins shook their heads. "She's not the kind of person who listens," Elijah said. Clara placed a hand on each of their shoulders, her grip firm. "Listen to me," she said. "You are brilliant. You are capable. And no one, no matter who they are, gets to make you feel otherwise. If this continues, we'll handle it together. But for now, you keep doing what you do best. Excel." Her words bolstered their resolve. They weren't just proving themselves to Mrs. Grace. They were honoring their father's memory and the lessons he had taught them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them head-on, with the quiet determination that had always defined them. Unbeknownst to the twins, their struggles were being silently observed. A powerful figure within the school district, visiting classrooms for an evaluation, had taken note of Mrs. Grace's behavior. The twins' brilliance, juxtaposed with the teacher's dismissiveness, painted a clear picture of bias and unprofessionalism. What would unfold in the coming days would not only expose Mrs. Grace, but also cement the twins' place as forces to be reckoned with in their new school. The next day, as the morning bell rang, the twins walked into Mrs. Grace's classroom with their usual quiet determination. The air seemed heavier today, tension palpable as though the room itself had absorbed their struggles. Serena glanced at Elijah as they took their seats, her eyes reflecting a silent pact. They would not let Mrs. Grace's attitude deter them. As the lesson began, Mrs. Grace introduced a new topic, advanced calculus. She wrote an equation on the board, her neat handwriting forming a complex problem. Turning back to the class, she surveyed the students with a scrutinizing gaze. "This," she announced, tapping the board with her marker, "is the foundation of higher mathematics. Let's see who's brave enough to attempt it." Elijah raised his hand without hesitation. Across the room, Serena mirrored his action, their confidence unshaken despite the circumstances. Mrs. Grace's eyes narrowed as they darted between the two. "Elijah," she said, her tone clipped, "let's see what you've got." Elijah rose from his seat and approached the board, his mind already breaking down the problem into manageable parts. He picked up the marker and began working, explaining each step with precision. His voice was steady, his reasoning flawless. "First, isolate the variable," he said, circling a section of the equation. "Then apply the derivative rule here." Mrs. Grace crossed her arms, her lips pursed. "Interesting approach," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "But are you sure that's correct?" "Yes, Mom," Elijah replied, meeting her gaze. "Would you like me to double-check it?" Mrs. Grace smirked faintly, but before she could respond, Serena spoke up from her seat. "He doesn't need to. The solution is correct." The room fell silent. Other students exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by the twins' confidence. Mrs. Grace's smirk faded as she turned back to the board. She scrutinized Elijah's work, her frown deepening with each step. "Well," she said finally, "it seems you've gotten it right. But remember, speed is just as important as accuracy. Next time, try not to overcomplicate things." Elijah returned to his seat, his jaw clenched. Serena gave him a small nod of encouragement, though her own frustration simmered beneath the surface. Mrs. Grace's praise, if it could even be called that, felt more like a backhanded compliment. As the days passed, Mrs. Grace's behavior grew increasingly dismissive. She often ignored the twins' raised hands, calling on other students who struggled with even basic concepts. When the twins excelled on assignments, she dismissed their achievements with curt remarks. Yet her tone shifted dramatically when addressing their classmates, her voice warm and encouraging in stark contrast to her interactions with Elijah and Serena. The other students began to take notice. Whispers circulated in the hallways and cafeteria, subtle at first, but growing louder. "Why is Mrs. Grace so hard on the Johnson twins?" one student asked during lunch. "They're the smartest in the class." "I don't know," another replied. "She's always nitpicking their work, even when it's perfect." The twins heard the murmurs but said nothing. They had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. Instead of confronting Mrs. Grace directly, they focused on their studies, determined to let their performance speak for itself. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging group activity, the twins once again found themselves leading their respective teams. Elijah's group tackled a calculus problem, while Serena's team worked through an intricate geometry puzzle. Both groups completed their tasks with ease, presenting their solutions with confidence. Mrs. Grace's response was predictable. She nodded curtly, offered no praise, and moved on without comment. But as she turned to address the next group, something unexpected happened. A tall, bespectacled man entered the classroom, his presence commanding attention. His tailored suit and polished demeanor marked him as someone important. Mrs. Grace froze mid-sentence, her face paling slightly. "Dr. Calloway," she stammered, "I wasn't expecting you." The man smiled faintly, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on the twins. "I'm here for an unscheduled observation," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Please carry on." Mrs. Grace nodded, though her discomfort was evident. She resumed the lesson, her tone more measured now, her movements less confident. The twins exchanged a glance, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. As the class progressed, Dr. Calloway observed silently, taking notes on a sleek tablet. He paid close attention to Mrs. Grace's interactions with the students, his eyes narrowing slightly whenever she addressed Elijah or Serena. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Dr. Calloway remained seated. The students filed out, their chatter filling the hallway. Elijah and Serena lingered near the door, curious about the visitor's presence. "Mrs. Grace," Dr. Calloway said, his voice firm but calm, "may I have a word?" Mrs. Grace nodded stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The twins hesitated, caught between their desire to stay and their reluctance to eavesdrop. "Johnson twins," Dr. Calloway called, his tone softening. "A moment, please." They turned, surprised. Dr. Calloway gestured for them to join the conversation, his expression kind but serious. "I've been observing this class," he began, addressing the teacher, "and I couldn't help but notice a pattern in your interactions with these two students." Mrs. Grace's face flushed. "I assure you, Dr. Calloway, I treat all my students equally." Dr. Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it appears that Elijah and Serena are held to a different standard, one that is both unfair and counterproductive." Elijah and Serena exchanged glances, their surprise mirrored in each other's eyes. Mrs. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Calloway held up a hand. "These twins are exceptional," he continued, his tone firm. "Their work speaks for itself. Yet, instead of fostering their talent, you've created an environment where their achievements are undermined. This is not the standard of excellence we expect at Hillcrest High." Mrs. Grace's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Dr. Calloway turned to the twins, his expression softening. "Elijah, Serena, your perseverance is admirable. I've seen the effort you put into your work, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. You belong here, and don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The twins nodded, their hearts swelling with gratitude. For the first time since their arrival at Hillcrest, they felt truly seen. As they left the classroom, the weight on their shoulders felt a little lighter. Justice, it seemed, was finally beginning to catch up with Mrs. Grace. But the twins knew their journey wasn't over. They had more to prove, not just to their teacher, but to themselves. And they were ready. The turning tide. The soft hum of the school library filled the air as Elijah and Serena sat at a corner table, their heads bowed over a stack of textbooks. It was a routine they had established since arriving at Hillcrest. Use every free moment to prepare, not just for the academic challenges, but for the underlying tension that followed them like a shadow. "Did you notice how quiet the class got after Dr. Calloway spoke?" Serena asked, her voice a whisper as she underlined a passage in her geometry textbook. Elijah nodded, flipping through the pages of an advanced calculus workbook. "Yeah, it was like everyone was holding their breath. Even Mrs. Grace couldn't argue. She wanted to, though." Serena glanced up, her eyes meeting her brother's. You could see it in her face. "She'll try to push back," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "But we can't give her a reason to. We have to stay ahead." Serena leaned back in her chair, letting out a quiet sigh. It's exhausting, you know, having to prove ourselves every second. Elijah reached across the table, giving her hand a quick squeeze. I know, but we're not just proving ourselves to her. We're proving it to everyone who thinks we don't belong. Serena smiled faintly, her determination rekindled. Then let's make sure there's no room for doubt. The following week, the school buzzed with anticipation as the results of the district-wide academic assessment were announced. Hillcrest High prided itself on maintaining a top-ranking position, and students were eager to see how they had performed. Mrs. Grace's advanced math class had been particularly competitive, with many students aiming for perfect scores. The twins sat quietly as Mrs. Grace handed back the results, her expression unreadable. One by one, students murmured in reaction to their scores, some relief, some disappointment. When she finally reached Elijah and Serena, her hand paused slightly before placing the papers face down on their desks. Elijah flipped his over first, his eyes scanning the bolded number at the top. 100%. Every calculation, every explanation. Flawless. Serena turned hers over a second later, revealing the same perfect score. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, though she kept her expression measured. Well, Mrs. Grace said, her voice carrying the note of begrudging acknowledgement, it seems the Johnson twins have exceeded expectations. Again. Her words were met with a mix of reactions. Some students clapped quietly. Others exchanged glances. A few leaned over to sneak a peek at the twins' papers, curiosity etched on their faces. The tension in the room shifted, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of respect in their peers' eyes. As Mrs. Grace moved on, Serena whispered to Elijah, "Think she'll ever say 'good job' without sounding annoyed?" Elijah smirked. "Doubt it, but it's not about her. We know what we've done." The twins' growing reputation extended beyond the classroom. Word of their perfect scores spread through the school like wildfire, sparking admiration and intrigue. Students who had previously avoided or ignored them began approaching them for help with assignments or asking to join their study sessions. One afternoon, as they worked on a particularly challenging set of problems in the library, a girl from their class approached hesitantly. Her name was Gracian, and she was known for being one of the top students in the school. "Hey," she said, clutching her notebook nervously. "Do you mind if I sit with you guys? I'm stuck on problem 3, and I heard you're both really good at this." Elijah and Serena exchanged a glance before nodding. "Sure," Serena said, pulling out a chair for her. As they worked together, more students began to join, turning their quiet corner into an impromptu study group. The twins found themselves in the unexpected position of leaders, their explanations clear and patient, their presence magnetic. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grace's frustration simmered beneath the surface. She couldn't ignore the twins' achievements, but acknowledging them felt like admitting defeat. Her subtle digs continued. Comments about their luck or reminders that one success didn't guarantee another. Yet the twins' growing support from their peers left her increasingly isolated. Her turning point came during a faculty meeting when Dr. Calloway addressed the staff about fostering an inclusive and supportive environment. Though he didn't mention names, his pointed remarks about bias and its impact on students left no doubt about who he was referring to. "Every student deserves the chance to excel," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Our role as educators is to uplift, not hinder. When we fail to do so, we fail not just the student but our entire institution." Mrs. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks flushing. For the first time, she realized that her actions were under scrutiny and her reputation was on the line. The culmination of events came during the school's annual math competition, a prestigious event that pitted the brightest students against one another in a series of timed challenges. The twins were chosen to represent Hillcrest, a decision that Mrs. Grace reluctantly approved under pressure from Dr. Calloway and the school principal. On the day of the competition, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Students from neighboring schools filled the seats, their cheers and chatter creating an electric atmosphere. The twins stood on the stage alongside their competitors, their faces calm but focused. The first round began with individual challenges, each participant solving complex problems on a whiteboard in front of the audience. Serena went first, her movements swift and confident as she completed her problem in record time. The crowd erupted in applause. Elijah followed, his approach methodical and precise. When he stepped back from the board, revealing a flawless solution, the cheers grew even louder. Their synergy was undeniable, their brilliance impossible to ignore. As the competition progressed, the twins dominated each round, their scores propelling Hillcrest to the top of the leaderboard. By the final challenge, a collaborative problem-solving task, they had already secured victory. When the announcer declared them the winners, the auditorium erupted into a standing ovation. Elijah and Serena had exchanged a triumphant glance, their hard work and perseverance paying off in the most public way possible. In the audience, Mrs. Grace sat stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Dr. Calloway clapped enthusiastically, his smile broad and genuine. Back at school, the twins returned as heroes. Their victory was celebrated in the hallways, their names on everyone's lips. Even Mrs. Grace, cornered by the undeniable weight of their achievements, was forced to acknowledge their success. During their next class, she stood at the front of the room, her expression carefully neutral. "Elijah, Serena," she said, her voice trained but steady. "Congratulations on your performance at the competition. You've brought great pride to this school." The words, though grudging, marked a shift. The twins had not only proven their worth, but had also changed the narrative. They had shown that excellence could not be silenced, that determination could triumph over prejudice. As the class applauded, Serena leaned over to Elijah and whispered, "We did it." Elijah smiled. "Yeah, and we're just getting started." The unseen power. The quiet halls of Hillcrest High buzzed faintly with anticipation the morning after the twins' math competition victory. Though some students were already whispering about Elijah and Serena's performance, the school was in for a bigger surprise. A photograph of the twins holding their winning trophies had been published in the local newspaper, along with an article highlighting their exceptional talent and the challenges they had faced since transferring. Elijah leaned against his locker, reading the article on his phone. "They actually mentioned Mrs. Grace," he said, his tone half amused, half exasperated. Serena glanced over his shoulder. "Their journey has not been without obstacles," she read aloud. Instances of bias and doubt in the classroom only fueled their determination to succeed. She raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to put it." "She's not going to like this," Elijah murmured, sliding his phone back into his pocket. Serena smirked. "She doesn't like anything we do, so what's new?" When they entered Mrs. Grace's classroom that morning, the atmosphere was heavy. A stack of newspapers sat on her desk, the twins' photo on the front page visible to anyone who glanced. Mrs. Grace's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line as she scribbled notes on the whiteboard. The twins took their seats, their classmates offering quiet congratulations. Whispers circulated the room, growing louder as more students noticed the papers. "Did you see the article?" "It's all over town," one student murmured. "I didn't know they were this good," another whispered. Mrs. Grace slammed her marker onto the ledge of the board, the sharp sound silencing the room. "Settle down," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "We have a lot to cover today." She launched into a lecture on complex trigonometric functions, her tone clipped and her explanations rapid. It felt as if she were determined to reassert her authority, to remind everyone of her position despite the growing recognition of the twins' brilliance. But the class was distracted, their attention drifting back to the newspapers and the whispers of admiration for Elijah and Serena. Later that day, as the twins ate lunch in their usual corner of the cafeteria, Dr. Calloway appeared, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. He carried a folder under his arm and a warm smile on his face. "May I join you?" he asked. The twins nodded, surprised. Dr. Calloway pulled out a chair and sat down, his demeanor calm but purposeful. "I wanted to personally congratulate you both," he said, placing the folder on the table. "Your performance at the competition was extraordinary. You've brought immense pride to Hillcrest." "Thank you," Serena said, her voice humble but steady. "It means a lot." "It's more than just pride," Dr. Calloway continued. "Your story has resonated beyond our school. That article in the paper has caught the attention of the district board. They've asked me to look into ways we can better support students like you. Students who show exceptional talent, but face unnecessary hurdles." Elijah and Serena exchanged a glance. "What kind of support?" Elijah asked. Dr. Calloway opened the folder, revealing a proposal. "For starters, we're considering the creation of an advanced placement mentorship program. You two would be the first participants, and eventually, you could even mentor others. We also want to address the systemic biases that create these hurdles in the first place." The twins listened intently as Dr. Calloway outlined his plans. It wasn't just about them. It was about creating a better environment for all students. They felt a spark of hope, a sense that their struggles might lead to lasting change. "There's one more thing," Dr. Calloway added. "We're organizing a district-wide symposium on educational equity, and I'd like you both to speak. Share your experiences, your journey, and your insights. I think your voices could inspire others." Serena blinked, her eyes wide. "Speak? In front of the entire district?" "Yes," Dr. Calloway said with a smile. "You've already proven your abilities in math. Now it's time to let the world see the depth of your character." That evening, the twins sat in their living room, going over Dr. Calloway's proposal with their mother. Clara listened carefully, her hands folded on the table. When they finished, she leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "This is an incredible opportunity," she said, her voice steady. "But it's also a big responsibility. Are you ready for that?" Serena hesitated. "I think we are. But it's intimidating. What if we say the wrong thing? Or what if no one listens?" Clara reached across the table, placing a hand on each of theirs. "You've already shown more courage and determination than most adults. You've faced challenges head-on, and you've come out stronger. Sharing your story is just another way to make a difference." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. "We'll do it, not just for us, but for everyone who's been in our position." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. The twins worked with Dr. Calloway to craft their speech, drawing on their experiences to highlight the importance of perseverance, equity, and support. They practiced late into the evenings, their voices growing stronger and more confident with each rehearsal. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grace's demeanor became increasingly strained. Though she tried to maintain her usual authority, it was clear that the shifting dynamics in the school were unsettling her. The twins' success had drawn attention to her behavior, and whispers of potential consequences began circulating among the faculty. The day of the symposium arrived, the auditorium packed with students, teachers, and administrators from across the district. The twins stood backstage, their nerves evident but controlled. "You've got this," Clara said, squeezing their hands. "Just speak from the heart." When their names were announced, the audience erupted into applause. Elijah and Serena stepped onto the stage, their movements synchronized as always. They stood behind the podium, the bright lights casting long shadows across the room. Serena began, her voice steady but emotional. She spoke about their father, their move to Hillcrest, and the challenges they had faced adjusting to a new school. Elijah picked up where she left off, recounting their experiences in Mrs. Grace's class and the quiet bias they had endured. "But we didn't let that stop us," he said, his voice growing stronger. "We worked harder, studied longer, and proved that we belong, not just in this school, but in any space we choose to occupy." Their words resonated deeply, the audience hanging on every sentence. By the time they finished, the room erupted into a standing ovation, the sound echoing like a thunderstorm. Backstage, Dr. Calloway met them with a proud smile. "You've done more than inspire," he said. "You've started a movement." As they left the auditorium, the twins felt a sense of fulfillment they hadn't known before. Their journey was far from over, but they had taken the first step towards something greater. Together, they had turned the tide, proving that strength and determination could triumph over even the deepest prejudices. The standing ovation seemed to last forever, the sound reverberating in the auditorium like a heartbeat. Elijah and Serena stood at the podium, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the applause. For a moment, all the struggles they had faced, the whispered doubts, the dismissive comments, the subtle but cutting prejudice, felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter, as if sharing their story had lifted part of the burden. As the applause subsided, Serena leaned into the microphone for one final word. "This isn't just our story," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's the story of so many students who deserve a chance to be seen for who they are and what they can do. We're just getting started." The audience erupted again, this time with cheers added to the applause. The twins left the stage to the sound of voices calling their names, their hands clasped tightly as they walked together. Backstage, Dr. Calloway greeted them with open arms. "That," he said, his voice filled with admiration, "was extraordinary. You didn't just speak, you connected. You showed them what resilience looks like." Clara stood behind him, her face glowing with pride. "You two were incredible," she said, pulling them into a hug. "Your father would be so proud of you." Elijah smiled, the warmth of her words filling him with a quiet strength. "Thanks, Mom," he said. "We just wanted to make a difference." "And you have," Dr. Calloway added. "This is just the beginning. The mentorship program is moving forward, and I've already had administrators approach me about expanding it district-wide. Your story is inspiring real change." The twins' return to Hillcrest High the next day felt surreal. Everywhere they went, students stopped to congratulate them. Teachers nodded approvingly, some even pausing to offer words of encouragement. For the first time since their arrival, it felt like the school was truly theirs, a place where they belonged not because they proved they could, but because they had earned it. In Mrs. Grace's class, the atmosphere was different. The usual tension that hung over the room seemed to have lifted, though Mrs. Grace herself remained a picture of forced neutrality. She began the lesson without her usual clipped tone, her demeanor subdued. As the twins worked through the assigned problems, they could feel her eyes on them, watching, calculating. But this time, her scrutiny didn't bother them. They had nothing to prove to her anymore. At the end of class, as the other students filed out, Mrs. Grace cleared her throat. "Elijah, Serena, a word, please." The twins exchanged a glance, then approached her desk. Mrs. Grace hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a paper. "I'd read the article," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "And I saw your speech at the symposium." Elijah raised an eyebrow, and her eyes flicked to the side, as if struggling to maintain eye contact. "I wanted to say that. I may have underestimated you. Both of you." Serena's expression didn't change. "You did." Mrs. Grace flinched slightly but nodded. "Yes, I did. And I want to apologize. It's clear that you're both exceptionally talented, and I should have recognized that sooner." The twins stood silently, their faces unreadable. It wasn't the apology they had dreamed of. It felt more like an attempt to save face than genuine remorse. But it was something. "Thank you," Elijah said finally. "But we didn't need your recognition to know our worth." Mrs. Grace nodded, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "I suppose not. Still, I wanted to say it." As they left the classroom, Serena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Do you think she meant it?" she asked. Elijah shrugged. "Maybe, but it doesn't really matter. We're not doing this for her." Over the next few weeks, the changes at Hillcrest became increasingly visible. The mentorship program Dr. Calloway had proposed was officially launched, with Elijah and Serena as its first mentors. They began working with younger students, helping them navigate their studies and encouraging them to aim high, regardless of the challenges they faced. Their peers' attitudes continued to shift as well. Students who had once kept their distance now sought their advice, their respect for the twins growing with each interaction. The library study groups became a regular occurrence, with Elijah and Serena leading discussions and fostering a sense of community that had been lacking before. Even the teachers began to take notice. Mrs. Grace, though still reserved, began to call on the twins more often in class, her tone less dismissive and more curious. Other faculty members, inspired by Dr. Calloway's initiative, started incorporating discussions about equity and inclusion into their lessons, creating a ripple effect that spread throughout the school. One afternoon, as the twins walked home together, Elijah looked up at the clear blue sky. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" he asked, his voice quiet. Serena glanced at him, her expression soft. "I think he'd be more than proud. He'd probably say we're doing exactly what he always wanted us to do, making the world a little better." Elijah nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I think so too." They walked in companionable silence, the weight of their journey lightened by the knowledge that they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't. Together, they had turned their struggles into strength, their challenges into triumphs. And they knew, without a doubt, that their story was far from over. A test of resolve. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Hillcrest High as Elijah and Serena walked toward the library, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Since their victory at the symposium, life at school had become busier. Between classes, mentoring younger students, and preparing for their next big competition, they barely had time to catch their breath. Yet they thrived in the chaos, their bond growing stronger with each challenge. Today, however, a sense of unease followed them like a shadow. "Did you hear what Jacob said in class today?" Serena asked, her voice low. Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah. He said we only won because the school was trying to make a statement. That were just a good PR move." Serena's hands clenched into fists. "We proved ourselves 100 times over. What more do they want? Some people will always find an excuse to tear you down," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "But we didn't come this far to let a few whispers get in our way." As they entered the library, they found their usual study group waiting for them. Gracian, who had become one of their closest allies, waved them over to the large table in the corner. A mix of students had gathered, notebooks and textbooks spread out before them. The twins exchanged smiles, grateful for the growing support they had earned through sheer persistence. But just as they sat down, an unfamiliar figure approached the table. The man was tall, with a lean frame and sharp features. He wore a tailored suit and carried a sleek black briefcase. The entire library seemed to fall silent as he strode toward the twins, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. When he reached their table, he addressed them directly. "Elijah and Serena Johnson?" he asked, his voice smooth but commanding. "Yes," Serena replied cautiously. "I'm Mr. Holloway," he said, setting his briefcase on the table. "I represent the State Board of Education. I've been following your story, and I have an opportunity I believe you'll be interested in." The twins exchanged a glance, curiosity and suspicion flickering in their eyes. "What kind of opportunity?" Elijah asked. Mr. Holloway smiled faintly. "There's an upcoming statewide competition, one that draws the brightest minds from across the region. We're assembling a team to represent Hillcrest, and we'd like you both to lead it." The room seemed to hold its breath. The twins were no strangers to challenges, but this was on an entirely different scale. Competing at a statewide level would put them under a spotlight they had never experienced before. It was an honor and a test. "We'll do it," Serena said, her voice steady. Elijah nodded in agreement. "But we'll need to see the details." "Of course," Mr. Holloway said, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a thick folder and handed it to them. Take your time to review everything. This is a chance to showcase not just your talents, but the potential of Hillcrest as a whole. As Mr. Holloway left, the table buzzed with excitement. Grayson leaned forward, her eyes wide. This is huge, she said. You're going to crush it. We'll see, Elijah said, flipping through the folder. Looks like the competition involves both individual and team challenges. It's not just math. There's science, engineering, even creative problem solving. Serena grinned. Sounds like our kind of challenge. Over the next few weeks, the twins threw themselves into preparation. They balanced their mentoring duties with intense study sessions, often staying late into the night to tackle practice problems and refine their strategies. Their determination was unshakable, but the pressure began to mount. Rumors swirled around the school. Some students cheered them on, while others muttered about favoritism and questioned their ability to handle such a high-stakes competition. Jacob, the same student who had doubted them before, became particularly vocal. They're just a PR stunt, he sneered one day in the cafeteria. Hillcrest is putting all its eggs in their basket, but they're going to choke under the pressure. Elijah heard the comment but kept walking, his expression unreadable. Serena, however, stopped in her tracks. What did you say? She demanded, her voice sharp. Jacob smirked. You heard me. You might be good, but you're not that good. Just wait, you'll see. Serena opened her mouth to retort, but Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder. Let it go, he said quietly. He's not worth it. Serena hesitated, then nodded, though her anger simmered beneath the surface. The day of the competition arrived faster than they expected. The twins stood outside the grand auditorium, where the event was being held, the morning air crisp and cool. Clara stood with them, her hands resting gently on their shoulders. You've already won in my eyes, she said, her voice filled with pride. No matter what happens today, remember that. The twins nodded, their nerves replaced by a quiet determination. They entered the building and joined their team, a mix of students they had been mentoring and collaborating with for weeks. Together, they formed a diverse and talented group, united by a shared goal. The competition was grueling, with multiple rounds testing everything from theoretical knowledge to practical application. The individual challenges pushed the twins to their limits, but they excelled, their focus unshakable. In the team rounds, their leadership shone as they guided their peers through complex problems, their synergy evident to everyone watching. By the time the final round ended, the auditorium was electric with anticipation. The judges deliberated for what felt like an eternity before stepping onto the stage to announce the results. And the winners of this year's statewide competition, the head judge announced, are Hillcrest High School, led by Elijah and Serena Johnson. The room erupted into cheers as the twins and their team took the stage to accept their trophies. The moment felt surreal, a culmination of all their hard work and perseverance. But as they stood under the bright lights, they knew this was more than a victory. It was proof that they belonged, not just at Hillcrest, but anywhere they chose to be. Back at school the next day, the mood had shifted once again. The whispers of doubt had all but disappeared, replaced by admiration and respect. Even Jacob, the loudest of their critics, seemed to shrink in their presence. Mrs. Grace, however, remained an enigma. Though she had softened in her demeanor, her pride remained a barrier she struggled to overcome. But during the twins' next class, she did something unexpected. Elijah, Serena, she said, addressing them in front of the class. Congratulations on your win. It's a remarkable achievement, and I'm proud to have you in my class. The twins exchanged a glance, their surprise evident. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she had come to one. They nodded politely, their satisfaction coming not from her words, but from the knowledge that they had earned every bit of their success. As the class applauded, Serena leaned over to Elijah and whispered, "Looks like we passed the test." Elijah grinned. "Yeah, and I think we aced it. A legacy of change. The warm glow of the setting sun bathed Hillcrest High in hues of gold and orange, casting long shadows across the school courtyard. Elijah and Serena stood near the flagpole, their trophies in hand, as a small group of students and teachers gathered to celebrate their victory at the statewide competition. Balloons and streamers adorned the courtyard, and a banner overhead read, "Congratulations, Hillcrest champions." Gratian approached them with a wide smile, holding 2 slices of cake. "I think you've officially hit celebrity status," she joked, handing them the plates. Elijah chuckled, setting his trophy on the table behind them. "Not exactly what we were aiming for, but I guess it's nice to be noticed for something good." Serena nodded, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. Students from all grades mingled, their admiration for the twins evident in their smiles and laughter. The atmosphere was one of unity, a stark contrast to the skepticism and division that had greeted them when they first arrived. Dr. Calloway stepped onto a small makeshift stage, holding a microphone. The crowd quieted, turning their attention to him. "Today, we're not just celebrating a victory," he began, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "We're celebrating what it means to rise above challenges, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to inspire others to do the same. Elijah and Serena, you've shown us all what is possible when determination meets opportunity. You've made Hillcrest proud, not just with your achievements, but with your character." The crowd erupted into applause, cheers echoing across the campus. Serena felt a lump rise in her throat as she glanced at her brother, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Dr. Calloway continued, "This is just the beginning. Thanks to the efforts of these 2 remarkable students, Hillcrest High will soon launch a district-wide mentorship initiative designed to identify and support talent at every level. And I'm thrilled to announce that the Johnson twins will serve as co-chairs of this groundbreaking program." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, followed by another round of applause. Elijah and Serena exchanged a glance, their eyes widening in surprise. "What did he just say?" Serena whispered. "He said we're in charge," Elijah replied, his voice tinged with disbelief. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, the twins sat on the steps of the school building, watching the last of the students trickle out of the courtyard. Clara approached them, a proud smile on her face. "You've come so far," she said, sitting down between them. "I knew you were capable of great things, but even I didn't imagine this." Serena leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "It still doesn't feel real," she admitted. "We just wanted to prove we belonged here. We didn't expect all of this." "You've done more than prove you belong," Clara said. "You've shown everyone that they can do the same. That's the real victory." Elijah looked out at the darkening sky, his expression thoughtful. "It's a lot of responsibility," he said quietly. "What if we mess it up?" Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "You won't," she said firmly. "You've already faced more challenges than most people your age, and you've come through stronger every time. You've got this." The next day, the twins began planning for the mentorship program. They met with Dr. Calloway and a group of faculty members to outline their vision. The program would pair experienced students with younger ones, providing guidance not only in academics, but also in navigating social and personal challenges. "We want this to be about more than just grades," Serena explained during the meeting. "It's about creating a sense of belonging, making sure no one feels like they have to prove their worth just to be seen." Elijah nodded. "We know what it feels like to be overlooked, and we don't want anyone else to go through that." The faculty members listened intently, their respect for the twins evident. By the end of the meeting, they had a clear plan in place, with the first group of mentors set to begin training the following month. As word of the mentorship program spread, the twins became even more prominent figures at Hillcrest. Younger students approached them in the hallways, asking for advice or simply thanking them for their efforts. Even teachers who had once been skeptical now sought their input, recognizing their leadership and insight. Mrs. Grace remained a complex figure. Though she had softened considerably since their early days at Hillcrest, Her interactions with the twins were still tinged with formality. One afternoon, she stopped them after class, her expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. "I've been teaching for over 20 years, she began, her tone measured. "And I thought I understood what it meant to challenge my students, to push them to their full potential. But you too, you've taught me something I didn't expect." Elijah and Serena waited, unsure of what to say. "You've shown me that sometimes it's not about pushing," she continued. "Sometimes it's about stepping back and letting brilliance shine on its own. I may not have been fair to you in the beginning, and for that I'm sorry." The twins were taken aback. It was the closest thing to an apology they had ever received from her, and though it came late, it felt genuine. "Thank you," Serena said finally. "We appreciate that." Mrs. Grace nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Keep proving people wrong," she said before walking away. As the months passed, the mentorship program flourished. The twins continued to excel academically, but their true legacy was the culture shift they had sparked at Hillcrest. Students from all backgrounds began to find their voices, their confidence growing as they saw what was possible. One day, as the twins walked through the bustling hallways, Serena paused to watch a younger student helping a peer with a math problem. The sight brought a smile to her face. "Think Dad would be proud?" she asked softly. Elijah nodded, his own smile filled with quiet certainty. "Yeah, I think he'd say we did good." Serena looped her arm through her brother's as they continued walking, their steps in perfect sync. They had come to Hillcrest as outsiders, but they were leaving a legacy of unity, resilience, and hope, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, brilliance could not be silenced.